My name is Russell. Okay. Welcome to our second plenary session on U.S.-China relations in a world of civilizational competition. There's another very violent competition going on right now in Ukraine, but I think over the past years, the consensus developed concerning the priority of the U.S.-China competition, and that's what we'll be talking about today. Our first speaker is my friend and colleague at the Hoover Institution, Kiron Skinner, professor at Carnegie Mellon University. I had the pleasure of working with her in the Office of Policy Planning in the State Department, and she's one of the leading commentators on U.S. foreign policy. She will be speaking on President Reagan's four-part agenda and U.S.-China competition in the 21st century. Kiron, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to thank Mary and David for putting on this conference. As I look at the agenda and the assembled group of scholars and thought leaders, it's quite remarkable at this time in the middle of the Ukraine war, in the midst of our ongoing competition with China and with Russia, that a group of scholars are prepared to come together, spend a couple of days thinking about the background ideas and theories that ultimately will become public policy. I think Russell will agree with me that we left the State Department more convinced that ideas matter, not less, even though we didn't get as far as we wanted in advocating and promoting those ideas and translating them into public policy. And so the work that we are doing in this conference today, I think ultimately will influence the public policy dialogue, which has been devoid of real thought for quite some time in Washington. And I think that's a bipartisan problem. But I had this fanciful idea that the conference organizers seem to think is okay, of talking about the strategy that Reagan had for unraveling the Cold War as a partial lesson or set of lessons for US-China competition. I don't know if I'll succeed, but I'll try. Most people who have studied the end of the Cold War have never heard of the four-part agenda. There's very little written about it. But if you look closely at Reagan and George Shultz's own words, especially in the final years of the Cold War, they talked about it by name, but definitely by ideas in almost every speech they gave. It just didn't get picked up very much. And it's counterintuitive for what people would think about the Reagan era and the end of the Cold War. It focuses very little on bombs and bullets, almost nothing to do with trade and commerce, but other aspects of the US-Soviet competition that the US felt under Reagan, and ultimately George Shultz, that the US and the West had a comparative advantage. So it did, as one part of the four-part agenda, address the competition in terms of nuclear disarmament, not arms control. So one pillar was trying to get a nuclear disarmament treaty, which seemed almost impossible by most of the arms control experts coming out of the 1970s. Another part of it was resolving regional disputes along Western lines. Afghanistan, Angola, Nicaragua, a whole host of them around the world. And the idea of resolution was to have the Soviets withdraw and allow peace agreements that the Soviets would sign, and then the countries themselves would figure out their own political process. But for Ronald Reagan, that meant installing some type of more representative government. A third aspect of the four-part agenda included bilateral ties, more people-to-people engagements, more civic, scientific, and cultural exchanges, really fulfilling the Helsinki process of 1975, or the Helsinki Final Act, that Reagan had disagreed with, and at that time saying that it was turning over the keys of Europe to Russia or to the Soviet Union, but ultimately he became the biggest president, US president to champion the Helsinki Final Act. And finally, human rights. His human rights strategy included religious liberty, political liberalization, and economic liberalization. These were the pillars, all equal. Probably the first among equals was the human rights component, which may surprise some people. But if we think about a Soviet strategy in the US at the time that the Soviet Union began to crumble, I think this is at the center of it. It was continued in one way or another by the George H.W. Bush administration, but its heyday was the Reagan years. And it sounds now like a very straightforward, not controversial strategy, but in fact, it was breaking the back of the foreign policy consensus of the 1970s on US-Soviet détente, which said the Soviets are basically an equal power in the world. They shouldn't be treated as a pariah. And we have to accept a new international status quo where a bipolar world will continue to exist ad infinitum. The four-part strategy said no, that the international system could be transformed, and these dimensions that I just mentioned would ultimately transform the international system. The four-part agenda was rooted in an idea that there was indeed an ideological competition battle with the Soviet Union that the West could win. So in a way, it was making the case for a civilizational difference, and that vocabulary was often used. And it was making the case for expanding the zone of democratic states in the world. Very explicit that you need more, not less democracy, kind of a Kantian idea to have peace for the West. So it made no excuses about what it believed, and it was a pretty big idea. And I think in a lot of ways, we could say that it worked. Ronald Reagan gave a speech to the British Parliament in 1982, and he said he wanted two things. He wanted to rid the world of nuclear weapons, and he wanted to rid the world of totalitarianism. I think that is a big ideological battle that he was talking about at the time, and he really, I think, implemented it, but he made it a big ideological fight. And that's where many of his opponents, not just on the left, thought that he had gone too far and he would ultimately be unsuccessful. You know, when he talked about Marxism, Leninism ending up on the ash heap of history and the evil empire, these were part of the big ideological struggles that he wanted to address. Another part of this theory, I think, was domestic. And Reagan talked about this. He said, none of this will work if I can't get the American people on my side. So he took a page from his own book in the late 70s, where he'd given a 3-minute a day, 5-day-a-week radio broadcast that covered much of the country before we had talk radio. He gave a Saturday radio address, and I think they started with Reagan and have continued, but he was religious about the radio commentaries as from the Oval Office, because he felt he had to keep making his case over and over in short statements to the American public. And he felt that he had the American public on his side in 1986, after he got so close to a nuclear disarmament deal, the first in the Cold War, 40-year history, with Mikhail Gorbachev. But Gorbachev wanted him to sacrifice his defense initiative, known as Star Wars by critics, but the official name of Strategic Defense Initiative. And he said, no, I can't do it. And he later said, while still president, that the American public backed me on that because I came so close, but I failed because I wouldn't give up what the Soviets thought was a bargaining chip. So he had this theory that was pretty high altitude, very clearly stated. He felt he had the backing of the American public. I think you can't talk about the end of the Cold War without it. And I'll give some examples that I think help us understand what he was trying to do. On the arms control side, by December 1987, a year after Reykjavik, he sealed the deal on the first nuclear disarmament agreement of the Cold War, the INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, immediately started to work on this, what became known as START, a deep reduction in strategic arms. That part of the agenda was moving. On regional disputes, a lot of work that I still don't think we understand, and it's ironic given the events of last year, on the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Soviet withdrawal from Southern Africa, as part of what he would say would be an improvement in US-Soviet relations. All of these things were happening at the same time, and it was called the four-part agenda because Reagan felt one couldn't advance without the other, but they didn't have to be linked, their progress, to each other. So I think the settlements around the world were really important. And then he did something that the prior two presidents, including Trump, have not done, is that he declared countries like Nicaragua in the Western Hemisphere to be vital to American interest. And that unlike current presidents who've talked about the Western Hem, they've done very little. And they haven't really made an authoritative case that China needs to be out of the Western Hemisphere. But Reagan did on the Soviet Union and had a lot of success. On human rights, I think it was first among equals of the four-part agenda for Reagan. And he had unprecedented success dealing with the Soviets. In addition to high-profile Russian refuseniks or Jewish refuseniks being allowed to leave, such as Andrei Sakharov and Ida Nudel, who called George Shultz from Jerusalem when she arrived. He had other cases that were less known, like the 7 Pentecostals who stayed in the basement of the US Embassy for almost 5 years before Reagan was able to cut a deal in the spring of 1983 to get them out, and never crowed about it. But that moment of the Pentecostals in particular began the improvement in US-Soviet relations. The economic liberalization, I think we haven't studied enough, but it was important. It was a big attempt to get the Soviets to rewrite laws that would allow for individual competition. And that was something that ultimately I think Gorbachev caved on a bit. And then everyone knows about the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE, that's now the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I don't think we can imagine a West without it. And it has observer status at the UN. That's something that the US worked very hard at to encircle the Soviet Union with a zone of states that were committed to economic and political freedom. And that organization is critical in the Ukraine war today. And so there are all these high profile things that Reagan did on human rights. I've talked about on the bilateral ties. I think those were important. More scientific exchanges just ultimately undermined the Soviet regime. And I think that that was the point. All of this, we can put a bow around it and say, you know, this is a great strategy that contributed to the end of the Cold War. But I think it's more problematic dealing with China. Some of it may contribute to a grand strategy. Some of it would be impossible now. Trade wasn't a factor in the Cold War, the US-Soviet relationship, and the way that China is for the US now, and the world's more globalized. So you can't imagine a grand strategy that doesn't have a trade component. And I think the only component that the Trump administration succeeded on was on trade. It got almost nothing else. And I think that, and it came out of the White House, by the way. And I think that was partly by design, and I can speak to that. On the process of OSCE and the Helsinki Final Act and the Basket 3 on the human rights side, I've advocated for something like that for China, and I think that's pretty naive on reflection, because I don't see where a group, an intergovernmental grouping of that enormity and status will come together to counter China, because no one's been able to successfully make the case. that China is indeed the world's biggest pariah. And I think part of what allowed Reagan to do what he did is that he succeeded on the rhetorical side about the Soviet Union, that it made it a lot more possible for these institutional arrangements and semi-alliances to take place. I just don't see where we can ever replicate OSCE for China, though that would be an enormous, I think, move toward defeating China in the global competition for ideas, peoples, nations, and so on. And so those are some of the things that Reagan did I don't think are possible. On the human rights front, I think there's just the Trump administration just really blew it out of the State Department because it didn't understand the subtlety of what Reagan was doing. And it really has to start with the president. And I believe more now than ever, having served at the State Department, if you don't have the subtlety from the president, and if you don't have a commitment from the lieutenants, meaning the cabinet members, to turn the president's hunches and instincts into hypotheses, you will not get a grand strategy. So a lot of this is tied to personnel. But on the human rights front, as I just mentioned, it wasn't about attacking the Chinese on the Uyghurs, the equivalent, during the Reagan years. It was about religious liberty, economic liberalization, and political liberalization, all at the same time. I don't think, if someone can show me that that's what we were doing, I'd love to see it. I don't think we did anything even close. But the rhetorical attack on China became the political dimension of the China strategy, which meant there was no strategy at all. And if you aren't rewriting the strategies in the regional bureaus at state, you aren't achieving any lasting impact. And I doubt that the regional strategies for East Asia and the Pacific, EAP, the Near East, Europe and Eurasia, these big bureaus at state ever occurred. In fact, I know they did not. So I think there's some lessons from the Reagan period, but they're really hard ones. Reagan and Schultz had no daylight on the four-part agenda. They used the same vocabulary, they believed it. And I think they were winning the rhetorical war in the world in isolating the Soviet Union. And they used human rights to great fanfare when they needed to, and they kept it quiet, like in the case of the Pentecostals, which wasn't revealed for years later. But this is an example of when the last time that we had a grand strategy, the last time that it appeared to work, and maybe there's some lessons for China from this. But I think China's a harder problem. I don't think, on reflection, that the battle with the Soviet Union was as ideological as Reagan and others wanted to make it. In fact, it turned out to not be a civilizational fight at all. I think the real civilizational fight is right now. But even to say that, coming from the West, puts you potentially in the category of looking racist, because of we're in a battle with the Chinese. But the reality is that the Chinese are an economic, political, military, and cultural competitor for the West. That's not a racist statement. That's a statement of how deep and enduring their civilization actually is. And it's a compliment to their strength. I'm back to Russell right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiron. It was great to hear you. Kiron worked extensively on Reagan's writings, and your presentation reminds me of how prominent human rights were in that era. Actually, looking back over multiple administrations, there's probably no time since Reagan that human rights have been as prominent, which is remarkable. Now I'm happy, it's an honor to be able to introduce Gordon Chang, who is here with us live, not on Zoom. Gordon is maybe the most prominent commentator on China. I read him assiduously. I follow him on Twitter. He's the author of The Coming Collapse of China, Inshallah, and the great US-China tech war. He's here today to present to us on China Shakes the World, a revolutionary remaking of the international order. Gordon, please.
Thank you, Russell, and thank you, Mary and David. The topic is China, but I want to put that country, or maybe I should say that civilization, to put that country or civilization into context of today's developments. Today, the world is changing faster than our ability to understand that. And that means that some of the assumptions that we make about the world could be obsolete. And if they're obsolete, it means that we probably do not comprehend the danger. It certainly feels like we have transitioned from an historic period, going from a period of calm to one of general turbulence. History's next conflict could actually spread from the war in Ukraine, both east and west, across the Eurasian landmass, maybe even to North Africa. I mention this because chaos in Eastern Europe, China will probably take advantage of it to cause chaos in its neighborhood. And this chaos could be of unimaginable devastation. On February 27th, Vladimir Putin put his nuclear forces on high alert. This was a few days after that he actually talked about using his strategic weapons, his intercontinental ballistic missiles. On February 28th, President Biden talked to the American people and said, we shouldn't worry about nuclear war. I actually think that we should. And the reason is that on March 1st, Putin actually sortied his ballistic missile submarines and his land-based mobile missile launchers. Now, Russia has a doctrine of escalate to de-escalate, or perhaps we should say escalate to win. And this is threatening or using nuclear weapons faster, early in a conventional conflict. China also has that same doctrine, even though it's unofficial. We know this because in July of last year, China actually threatened to incinerate Japan because of Japan's support for Taiwan. Also, they threatened to incinerate Australia over its joining the AUKUS Treaty. That's the treaty among the United States, Australia, and the UK over nuclear submarines and others. So for us, we have a situation where the Chinese threaten not only our friends and partners, but also threaten us. All this century, Chinese generals and admirals periodically have made unprovoked threats to incinerate American cities. And this puts us into a position where we have to look at China's no first use doctrine, because this is going to define our relationships. But before we talk about China, I'd just like to answer one of Russell's questions this morning when he said that there was a lack of enthusiasm on the part of Western leaders to see Ukraine prevail. And I think part of it is because they have in fact been intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats. Of course, this does have consequences, not only in Eastern Europe, because we know that he will go after the 3 Baltic states, Poland, God knows where else, and the Chinese will use those threats against, of course, Taiwan, but also, as we mentioned, Japan, and very well, maybe even India. So let's talk about China. Putin is annexing or trying to annex territory because he wants to recombine the Soviet Union or maybe the greater Russian Empire. But Xi Jinping wants to annex the world and also the near parts of the solar system. And yes, I know that you think that that's ludicrous, but no, I'm not exaggerating. And we'll start with planet Earth. On July 1st of last year, Putin gave a speech to commemorate the founding of China's ruling organization, and he infamously said that he was going to crack skulls and spill blood of those who stood in China's way. But he said something more significant and chilling, and it was this, quote, "The Communist Party of China and the Chinese people, with their bravery and tenacity, solemnly proclaim to the world that the Chinese people are not only good at taking down the old world, but also good in building a new one." And by these words, Xi Jinping was working to impose China's imperial era system, where the Chinese rulers felt that they not only had the mandate of heaven over Tianxia, or all under heaven, but also that heaven compelled them to rule the entire world. Xi Jinping and his subordinates have been talking for this century about this notion of Tianxia. So for instance, Wang Yi, who was the foreign minister, in September 2017 wrote an article in Study Times, which is the Central Party School's authoritative newspaper. And in that article, Wang Yi wrote that Xi Jinping's thought on diplomacy, and in Communist Party lingo, a thought is an important ideological body of work. Wang Yi wrote that Xi Jinping's thought on diplomacy made innovations on and transcended traditional Western theories of international relations of the last 300 years. You take 2017, you subtract 300, and you get within spitting distance of 1648. So Wang, with his time reference, was referring to the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, which established the current system of sovereign states. So when Wang Yi writes that Xi Jinping wants to transcend this system, it means that China's leader believes that there's no sovereign states in the world, or no more of them than China. So China is not, as President Biden will tell you, and a lot of smart people in this town in Washington, China's not competing with us within the Westphalian international system. He wants to overthrow it altogether, which means that China, once again, is ruled by a revolutionary. With regard to the solar system, since about 2018, Chinese officials have openly talked in public about the moon and Mars as sovereign Chinese territory. That's right, part of the People's Republic of China. And that means they consider those heavenly bodies to be like the South China Sea, theirs and theirs alone. And that means that they'll exclude us if they get there first. And we don't have to speculate about that because that's what China's officials actually talk about. April of last year, Beijing announced the name of its Mars rover, and Beijing said, well, the name of the rover is Zhurong because Zhurong is the mythical god of fire in China. Yeah, Zhurong is the god of fire, but he's also the god of war and the god of the South China Sea. So is Xi Jinping going to plunge the world into war? Well, in a sense, he's already done that. He has given, and he's continuing to give, Vladimir Putin the means to conduct war on Ukraine. Now, a lot of Chinese officials in Beijing, maybe even most of them, are really uncomfortable with what Xi Jinping is doing, but it doesn't really matter because Xi is able to ignore them. And he's able to ignore them because he's a strongman. And strongman rule, unfortunately, is inherent in China's system, Communist Party system, which idealizes struggle and domination. When you start to look at the era of the current strongman, it's marked by a return to totalitarianism and erratic rule. And because of that, it resembles the era of Mao Zedong. Mao took a regime which was supposed to be run by a committee. He grabbed power, he turned it into one-man rule. He used his power to embark on these ruinous campaigns like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, reversed that, but Xi Jinping has reversed Deng Xiaoping. Xi Jinping, who reveres Mao, has grabbed power. And by doing that, he has reversed the process of institutionalization of the Communist Party. And that means, you start to look at this and people say, oh, Mao Zedong, he really was an aberration in communist history. No, he's not. There's been strongman rule at the beginning of the communist era, and there is strongman rule now. This is important because the civilization of China is taking on another civilization, or at least a part of another civilization, and that is the United States of America. 2 points here. China considers the United States to be its enemy. Second part, we're not deterring China. On the first part, Communist Party doesn't try to hide its antagonism to the United States. Matter of fact, it goes out of its way to tell us how much they hate us. May 2019, People's Daily, the most authoritative publication in China, carries a landmark piece declaring a people's war on the US. And this hostility has continued to the current day. where we see both People's Daily and Global Times, the tabloid that People's Daily controls, accuse us of barbaric quote unquote acts or accuses us of working with China's enemies. And people might say, do we really care? This is just propaganda after all. Yeah, we do care. We care because it looks like China is laying the justification for a strike on the American homeland. I'm not saying China will do it. I'm just saying China is justifying what they might do. Second thing. Oh, I should mention James Lilly, our great ambassador at the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s, actually was very clear about this. He said, China always telegraphs its punches. Well, we have been telegraphed. On deterrence, it's pretty clear, especially after the fall of Kabul. We've seen all of these propaganda releases from People's Daily and the Global Times about how we are not deterring China, how we have become incapable. Global Times says we can't win a war anymore. And the Global Times has actually talked about the failure of the United States to stand up to a mighty China. How could we stand up to a mighty China, Global Times asked in August, when we couldn't deal with the ragtag insurgents of the Taliban? Global Times, to bring this into relevance, actually talked about in August about what would happen when China invaded Taiwan. They didn't say if, they said when. Global Times talked about when China invades Taiwan, the island would fall within hours and the United States would not come to help. And in an editorial on October 4th, they ran a piece which had the title, quote, "Time to warn Taiwan secessionists and their fomenters, war is real." China's political system has become militarized. It's become militarized because when Xi Jinping became general secretary of the Communist Party in the end of 2012, in other words, he became China's ruler, he didn't have a political base. He became China's ruler because he was the least unacceptable choice. He was acceptable to all factions, but nobody's first choice. That may have been a great way to become paramount ruler in China, but it was not a great way to govern in an increasingly factionalized Communist Party. So what Xi Jinping did was to create a faction of his own. And the faction that he looked to were certain flag officers in the People's Liberation Army. So China's system has become militarized. We see that China's military officers, they're putting their stamp on diplomacy. They're grabbing a greater proportion of the country's resources. As we saw at the National People's Congress meeting last month, the Chinese military budget was announced to increase by 7.1%. And the growth target for gross domestic product, which most people think is unattainable, was only 5.5%. We know that these numbers probably don't reflect reality, but they do reflect the relative position. The PLA is getting more and more money. What we're seeing is something like 1930s Japan, when the Japanese military, like the Chinese military today, was emboldened by success and became ultranationalist. Then, like now, civilians controlled Asia's biggest army only loosely. And then Japanese media publicized this notion that, that Japan was being surrounded by enemies. And that's exactly what the Communist Party today says about China. So Beijing's foreign policy has always been tightly controlled and bound to domestic political intrigue. That's probably more true today than it's been before. We know that Xi Jinping has a low threshold of risk because, first of all, he inherited this consensual political system that Deng Xiaoping left him through Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. But as Xi Jinping grabbed power, he also grabbed accountability, which means he has nobody else to blame. In 2017, when things go China's way, this is perfect being Xi Jinping. Life is absolutely grand because you're getting all the credit. Come 2022, when things are not going China's way, it ain't so good being China's paramount leader. Also, Xi Jinping, he ended up increasing the cost of losing political struggles by jailing his opponents and other tactics. So Xi knows that he's at risk. And he's also at risk because China itself is beset by problems. We talk about a weak Soviet Union. Well, China right now has a debt crisis for which it has no answer to, a stagnating economy, worsening food shortages, a deteriorating environment, and accelerated COVID-19 outbreaks. And if all of this weren't bad enough, China stands on the edge of the steepest demographic decline in history in the absence of war or disease. Last fall, 2 Chinese demographers from Xi'an actually published a study which said that China would lose half its population within 45 years. Do a little bit of arithmetic, and at the end of the century, China and the US probably have about the same number of people. China might have about 20 million more. So we really are in a situation right now where China is challenging us. We've got to defend Taiwan. We got to do all sorts of things, but this is a exceedingly dangerous moment. China and Russia are driving events in the world. We are seeing our State Department for ages has tried to create stability, to manage stability, but they're trying to do that in a world where the #1 feature of things is change. And right now, we Americans, people in the West, we have to manage not just change, but we have to manage turbulent change. Thank you.
Gordon, thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions that we'll come to after our third speaker, Professor Xudong Zhang of NYU. I'm happy to introduce him as a fellow humanist, professor of comparative literature and East Asian studies at NYU. Xudong will be speaking on the genealogy of post-Westernism, the old, the new, and the fantastical in the age of Sino-US competition. Please, Xudong.
Thank you, Russell, for your introduction. I want to thank Mary and David for inviting me. I was looking forward to joining you in person. I'm in New York City, but unfortunately, I'm not feeling well. So I will be struggling to remain, to sound coherent and lucid. If not, just blame either pollen allergy or even Omicron. I have to be tested on Monday to know for sure. So just bear with me. Let me share my document on the screen. So I did prepare a PPT for this talk. So I'll just bring it onto the screen. Can you see that? Can you see it?
Blank screen.
Really? Let me do it again.
Try again.
Let me. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
The first page?
Yeah.
Okay, good. This is the last page, so I'll just bring go through it quickly. Russell, I have, how much time do I have? 20 minutes?
Excuse me?
How much time do I have? 20 minutes or 15 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go fast. It's about the discourse of a post-Westernism or the post-Western era as a public discourse. So first thing first, I want to make a sort of a discursive differentiation. So what is this thing is all about? As far as I can see, there are sort of 4 different kinds, at least 4 different ways of approaching this discourse. As it sort of goes around in China now. By the way, this talk was delivered in Chinese at a conference last December at the Fudan University School for China Studies, organized by Zhang Weiwei. In the initial conference invitation, I saw him as a keynote speaker as well. So that was the Chinese version. It's different, but it's related. So I'll just share this piece of information. I think the post-Western era, or 后西方时代, as a current discourse in China, I think we can see 2 different kinds. One is just a very, on the sort of surface, it's a propagandist discourse, hastily made on order topic to cater to real or imagined government preferences or popular sentiments. So in a way, we could see it as a sort of an academic equivalent to so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. There's no guarantee that this is kind of an accurate reading of the government policy or party line on the part of the intellectuals or academics. So it could be fantastical in that particular sense, but certainly it's part of shares the sort of a popular sentiments in China. So that's the most superficial level of this discourse. The second level is a kind of a sideshow of the geopolitical and industrial policy oriented strategic thinking. It's a parallel to that kind of strategic thinking, but as far as I can see, there's no in-depth sort of dialogue or collaboration between these two sides. The third level is an intellectual and cultural political undercurrent within modern and contemporary Chinese history. It runs pretty deep, and it has a long history in the genealogy. The last sort of aspect or dimension of this discourse is in a sort of a utopian way, it could be seen as a critical or even self-critical discourse in response to this question. It's a Chinese response to this general question originating from the West. I quote Mark Fisher in his Capitalist Realism, which is supposed to be a quote from either Zizek or Frederick Jameson. The line goes, "It is easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism." So in other words, it's a sort of part of the wider, more widely shared intellectual political search for alternative. But this is in a sort of a hypothetical utopian way. This discourse may or may not have the potential of participating in that kind of discourse. So after this very simple qualification, I'll just move on to this question: which West are they talking about, right? And what kind of what does it mean to suggest post-Western? How do we make of that post? So first, let me address this post. Ever since the 1980s, there is this Chinese academic discourse of postology or 后学. It's ironically suggested by its detractors and opponents, the critics. So first thing we can think of this is we should talk about is this post as in postmodernism and the postmodernity. There is this very important overlap between post-Western, the post in post-Western, and the post in postmodern, which I will return to. The second post is sort of the post in post-colonialism and the post-coloniality. It's related to the discourse of postmodernism, to be sure, but it has more sort of a socio-political, institutional, geopolitical implications. Also, it has to do with identity, ethnicity, the nation, the region, and so on and so forth. So the third post is simply as in post-industrial. It refers to a sort of a socio-economic, technological development. The fourth meaning of that post is in sort of, it's more political and geopolitically sort of immediate in the post-Yalta sort of a world order, a post as in post-Cold War, or even post-Pax Americana. So it's the sort of more in the political policy domain. The last post, as we could think of, at least we could ask whether this is the same post as in the post-revolution, or for that matter, post-socialism. As to the genealogy of post-Westerns in the Chinese context, I want to very briefly mention this. We don't have time to go into any one of them, but I'll just draw a list. Basically, to suggest that this is nothing new, the attempt, the desire, or the fantasy to talk about the post-Western era has been going on in China as a Chinese discourse for many decades. In reversed chronological order, we could look at the post-911, sort of a discourse from the end of history to clash of civilizations, external challenges, and the regrouping, the re-intensification of Western identities. That's one way to look to understand sort of this current Chinese context discourse of post-Western. But actually, compared to that post-911 discourse, post-Western era, the current one is rather limited and superficial. The second instance would be this collapse of Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, the Western triumphalism, and the intensification of Chinese socialist identities around 1991. So on the looking at the Western sort of this Western triumphalism, it's precisely because sort of the West has won this discourse, generating a certain kind of pushback or resistance, or the sort of awakening of particular identities in other parts of the world. So the Chinese socialist identity is in a sort of ironical sense, because after Tiananmen crackdown, for instance, there was this line authored, supposedly said by then president of China, Yang Zhang, says, now it's no longer the question about socialism saving China, but rather it's about China saving socialism. So that's the sort of the post-Western discourse of maneuvering sort of around that time. Then in a sort of more global context, from the period of mid-50s to the mid-70s, namely from the Bandung Conference to the end of the Vietnam War, the upheavals in the sort of, worldwide movements in decolonization and national independence, that was the one of the last sort of momentous waves, not only in theory, but also in practice, in collective struggles, defined in a loosely in post-Western sense, again, as sort of filtered through current Chinese discourse. Before that, it's the two independence, sort of national independence events of with world historical implications, the 1945 independence of India and the founding of the PRC in 1949. The PRC founding really could be said to have been concluded in 53 with the end of the Korean War, and so on and so forth. So I'm just the 42, the Pacific War, the Japanese discourse of world historical nations, the overcoming of the modern. Before that, the interwar period, the intellectual resources, inspirations, communism, fascism, Zionism, and ever since in the recent 2 decades or so, the growing influence of the Carl Schmitt in China, for instance, can be attributed to this sort of extremely stressful, but also extremely productive period of interwar, in interwar Europe, and to a lesser degree Japan as well. Before that, the First World War, which was in China, referred to at that time as the European War, or Ozhan, right? Along with the Russian Revolution, the May 4th New Cultural Movement, the burgeoning of national capitalism in China, because they had a break from the domination of Western powers, and the birth of Chinese Communist Party. That could be said as a historically important moment of, let's say, going beyond the West in terms of imagination, in terms of searching for alternative. So and even before that, we could point to the European revolutions around 1848, all the way to the First World War. But in the middle, the important instances or historical experiences could be sort of, I mean, in terms of the German Sondersweg and the Japanese Meiji Restoration. So just, it's a very sort of a quick going through of this sort of genealogy of post-Westernism, in the context of which we could say that the current discussions are nothing new. If anything, it's tends to be more superficial and less thoughtful. Certainly, it hasn't generated this sort of enormous socially concrete resonance. Okay. I guess then the second question you want to ask is, what do you mean by the West or Western? So I will basically skip this part because for mostly the Chinese understanding of the West overlaps with the West's self-understanding in terms of its defining historical experiences, events, intellectual discourses. So from the Greek, Roman, from antiquity to Middle Ages, all the way to the modern era. In a nutshell, I think Samuel Huntington, when he in Clash of Civilizations, when he makes the observation rather, that Russia is not, the Russian civilization is not really part of the Western civilization. He draws a whole list of these defining historical experiences, right, including, for example, the Reformation, the Renaissance, the earlier Industrial Revolution, Enlightenment, and it goes on, arguing that Russia was not really part of this historical evolution. Therefore, it's not part of Europe, not part of the West. So if we look at the list Huntington draws up, it's pretty much the list with which China, or the average Chinese educated a person would understand the West, until there is a point of divergence. And I will just list a few of these. These are really familiar to us. This is divergence, the point of divergence, the emergence of civil society, its attendant sort of rights such as freedom of assembly, the freedom of speech, world trade, colonial world system and its accompanying cultural ideological domination, gunboat diplomacy, sphere of influence, or open door policy. That's this American response to sphere of influence in Asia, in China, and extraterritoriality, all of which were historically associated with imperialism. The Cold War, sanctions, the embargoes, containment, and lastly, democracy, both parliamentary and electoral, human rights, peaceful evolution, a color revolution, and so forth. So these are the points which raise alarm or resistance, pushbacks, intellectual discursive nature, or in terms of state policy. So these are the sort of, even though these are acknowledged as defining features of the West, but these are also sort of constitute points of flashpoints, confrontation, antagonism, suspicion, and so on and so forth. We'll skip this part. However, when you talk about the postmodern era, it's also useful to remember, even as early as Samuel Huntington, I mean, he listed these areas and fields and domains where the West still retains supremacy or preeminence, dominance. So it's a usual suspects, the list, from own and operate the international banking system, which becomes really pronounced in this during Russia's invasion of Ukraine, all the way to the dominate the sort of high-tech weapons industry. But Huntington tends to list these sort of tangible, physical, technological strengths. And I want to add a few more less tangible, but even more important factors: the control of global media and information flow, which is listed only as the domination of international communication. Russell, are you going to remind me of time limits?
You could close up in a minute or two.
Okay. So these are very real Western advantages, which would be hard for anyone to imagine that any country, China in particular, would be able to go beyond. So therefore, the trap of post-Westernism is this at both theoretical level or at the sort of a technical level would be daunting. I will skip the middle part. Let me jump directly to the conclusion. I will just read these 2 pages. As ideology or as utopia, the discourse of moving beyond or getting past, that's the meaning of whole or go post, can only be effectively and meaningfully analyzed within and through the dialectic between the particular and the universal. The ultimate measurement, the frame of reference, do not come from a presumed newcomer as rulemaker or as law enforcer of a new world order, superseding the US or Western domination by blunt material and ideological force, but rather from a set of higher, broader, and more inclusive and internally pluralistic and productive values rooted in and produced by concrete forms of life over a long period of time. So therefore, at best, the current Chinese discourse on post-Westernism would mean a search for alternative to and the ways of appropriating the existing modes and experience in material and cultural production and in social organizations, the political institutions. The outward stance and the internal substance of this challenge, quote unquote, is not necessarily toward the other as they are meant for the self in the sort of idealistic sense. It will be best formulated as a question on if China as a name for ongoing collective practice can and will be able to outproduce the liberal capitalist democracies in economic, technological, and intellectual artistic domains. If it, while seeking to outproduce the West in quantitative terms, is also creating a more productive and a more humanly meaningful form of social political system in qualitative, that is, in human terms. So I will stop here, Russell.
Okay, Xudong, thank you very much. And thanks to all 3 speakers. We have a half an hour for questions and answers. Who do I see? Please, Alex.
Is there a mic?
I'm sure there is.
Thank you. This is a question.
Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. My name is Alex. I'm a junior at Yale, currently studying humanities. I work for the Hudson Institute, looking at some of these issues, and I have a question for Dr. Skinner mostly, and that's your remarks on the civilizational contest have been widely reported on, and you also asked Miles the question yesterday about sort of the framing of the civilizational competition. I was wondering, sort of within policy planning, how did you guys think about civilizational competition, specifically institutionally, right? I mean, you were talking about State Department bureaus and sort of reorganizing them. If we're thinking in terms of civilizational competition, at this like theoretical level, it's not super obvious to me what concretely that means when it comes to policy. And I'm curious if you could sort of clarify that.
Karen?
Thanks for that. Hi. Thanks for that question. I think you're asking more than one question, so I'll try to get to all of them. In terms of what we were doing in policy planning, I think that's a bigger question that I was talking with a group of young people about yesterday. It really goes to a larger situation that I think has been going on for most of this new century and probably part of the last one. It's almost impossible now to do big strategic thinking in the US federal government around foreign policy, largely because of, I think, the pace of US foreign policy. and the small size of the bureaus or offices across the interagency devoted to them. Some have been dismantled altogether. And so there isn't a real appetite for the big strategic thinking, and I don't see it coming back. The office I ran has shrunk in size since I left. I don't think it'll get bigger. There's no incentive to do it. And the best strategic thinking when it's happened has come out of the NSC, and it's basically dismantled the directorate over time that would do the kind of NSC 68 letter X type of ideas. So I think it's the government's not organized for something like what we want it to do. Second, on this idea of civilization, I think it's, how would it influence policy? I think that's what you're saying. I think the real question is, and this goes to some of the issues laid out in Gordon's presentation, how do you rewrite a strategy around China, which has to come out of the Bureau? And how do you do it for the Near East? How do you do it for all regions of the world? And how do we begin to get the bureaus to think about bigger questions, provide them with the incentive to do it? And also the China issue is so cross-cutting, both in terms of functional bureaus and regional ones. Our government's not organized yet to do any of that in a big competition. So some of us have talked about the need for a big reorg of the State Department to address challenges in the 21st century. Russell will recall I talked a lot about the need for developing strategies to address the global South as a potential zone that we could work with in our competition with China, with Russia, but also as emerging countries. But there's no possibility of doing something like that within the State Department or the NSC or DOD, given the way they look at the world in terms of regional groupings. So big ideas, I think, to go to your question, have a hard time finding their way into policy, in part because of the way our government's organized, which is still along Cold War lines for the most part.
Gordon, are you trying to add something?
Miles Yu, who worked for Chiron, actually put this out, I think, very clearly. He said that the competition between the United States and China is misunderstood. The Communist Party state sees the United States as an existential enemy because of the inspirational impact that we have on the Chinese people. So it's not our policy that causes problems. It is who we are. And so when they call us an enemy, we should call them an enemy. We should treat them like they treat us. I think that this is, I'm unburdened by government. But it seems to me that when we've seen what China has done, and it has killed Americans in great numbers, we have no choice but to defend ourselves. We are, by the metrics, a far stronger society than China. And yet we could lose our country because we're not defending ourselves. And this is especially ironic because right now China is particularly vulnerable. It wouldn't take too much to go back to the things that Kiron was talking about in terms of Reagan's strategy. These are things that we could do to ensure, to borrow Reagan's phrase, that we win and they lose. In other words, they stop killing Americans and they stop doing what they're doing to our society.
If I can just add, Gordon says we're not defending ourselves, and that is consistent with the decrease in the defense budget, the shrinking of the Navy, for example. But it's also consistent with the incapacity of our foreign policy machine, the State Department. So if I can come back to Alex's question, and Chiron, you'll appreciate the context that Alex from Yale studied with Charlie Hill. Charlie Hill was a legend in thinking about civilization and culture as a component of the world of multiple nations in which foreign policy operates. That is thoroughly foreign to what goes on in the State Department now. For the State Department now, foreign policy is just the sum of 150 odd bilateral relations. There's no way to talk about the global south. There's no office for the global south. There's no office for the transatlantic. This weakening of the State Department internally is compounded by the amount of foreign policy that is really owned by the Pentagon and the amount that's really been occupied by Congress through various acts of legislation. So it really restricts the ability of the government to act as a sovereign state in the world. Anyhow, David Pan.
Thanks, Gordon. Thank you. This is a question for Gordon and perhaps also to Xudong. Thanks for your presentations. What I'd like to think about is maybe if Gordon, you could talk a little bit about the ideological or basis, I guess the ideological basis for the rivalry between China and the U.S. Because I mean, I think what you've painted is a picture of how China is seeing the U.S. as an enemy, but if it has these grand ambitions of taking over the Earth and the solar system, it has to be based on some vision of a kind of ideological basis for that takeover, I think. Unless I guess the alternative is that they have this ambition, but they don't have much to back it up in a sense. And I guess one thing that you said that was interesting to me is that that there's this threat of nuclear war, and it could be really an outgrowth of precisely the weakness of vision, coupled with that ambition, that leads them to these sort of kind of extreme measures where they're not able to actually carry out that vision in a kind of more measured way, I suppose. And I guess I'm wondering what you thought about, or maybe what Xudong thinks about the way in which this notion of a post-Western vision or ideology is somehow fitting into that kind of ambition for China. Thanks.
Thanks, David. I think there are really two bases for China's ideological view. One of them, of course, is Telos-Paul, which I talked about. The other, of course, is just communism. Many people say that the Communist Party is no longer communist, but you go back to what Mao first said and what Mao actually chiseled into the Temple of Great Harmony. He talked about a worldwide communist revolution. So you put those two things together, both of those ideologies, which of course are inconsistent, nonetheless lead Beijing to the same conclusion, that it must rule the world. When you talk about nuclear weapons, I think a lot of Chinese thinking on the use of nuclear weapons, as well as the use of other weapons of mass destruction, really go back to Mao. Where he had these notions where, because China was much more populous than, for instance, the United States, that China could suffer 300 casualties, as he talked about in, I guess it was 1955 or so. I might have the year wrong on that. But he talked about how China could suffer these casualties and still prevail in a conflict. So I think that you start to look at those notions that started with the People's Republic's first leader. And you see those themes carried forward to today by Chinese military officers in their writings, which is really quite scary because they do believe that they do have the ideological basis to do it. There's one other thing, and that is that there is a belief in Beijing that, and this goes back to Xudong's comments about how the East is rising and the West is falling. And there's this notion that this is now China's time. So you put all of this together and it really creates a toxic brew where Beijing believes that now it can do what it wants and it doesn't have to worry about the rules-based international order. Or in other words, that we Westerners, we Americans can talk about rules, but China knows that we won't enforce them. And because Beijing believes that, it feels that it can engage in conduct which we find abhorrent, but which they believe we will accept anyway. So when you have the justification in your mind that you have the right to rule for those two reasons, plus you believe you're strong, that means this becomes a very exceedingly dangerous situation because Beijing will take steps that we wouldn't think that they would. They calculate their interests differently. They see the world differently than we do.
Xudong, would you like to add something?
Yes, I only want to add a note to David's question. In terms of the sort of the competition for the right to be part of the global the global, how should I say, competition or whatever, rivalry in defining the universal. So you speak of Tianxia, right? That all under heaven, but the Chinese Tianxia is basically a particular universal. It's a paradox. You cannot be universal if you are particular. You cannot be particular if you are universal. But somehow this Chinese vision of, you could call it ideology, of the universal, I think stems from this historically defined experience of the universal being in actuality. It's just a particular discourse. In that sense, America is just a particular country, a particular form of production, a social form. The fact that it could get overextended is a sort of a matter of historical contingency or opportunity or advantage. But all these things are historically and conceptually very fluid. So China now, given its achievements in material production, might be able to move up to creating a different kind of social form, a different kind of a cultural, a symbolic value system. All these are just in speculative terms, but this is the moment, the turning point for Chinese intellectuals, college students in the urban middle class to imagine a kind of a membership in this business of participating in defining the universal. I think if that would cause alarm, then that only would cause, it will sort of return to China. This international suspicion, particularly this American suspicion, would return to China as in the form of grievance or resentment that could easily be imagined. So I guess I realize I'm talking at a level of abstraction, but really this viewing the universal as particular in nature, I think has a lot to do with the sort of perceptions and misperceptions of how China thinks, so to speak. I mean, we all know that there's no such thing as China as a monolithic entity. We're talking about, radically different things, radically heterogeneous. If you want to single out the Communist Party, the Chinese government, the bureaucracy, or the capitalist economy, each demands a different kind of intellectual critical approach, throwing everything together and try to formulate a kind of a one China policy or one China theory. Usually it fails, and it fails quite spectacularly.
Okay, Kiron, did you want to add something to this conversation?
Yes. Okay. So I just wanted to go back to the first question and then connect it to something Gordon just said in the second question. And this issue of China as seeing itself in an ideological win period in history, and we're not really hitting back, so to speak, in what it says and what it does. I think it's actually hard to even do it with any credibility, both domestically and internationally, until we make a case about China and until we develop something like a larger strategy. I do think that, and it's because of the unique history that we have with Chinese. For example, in the 1930s, China was something of the enemy, and you had African-American elites like W.E.B. Du Bois and others defending Japan after the invasion of Manchuria, seeing that on the belief that Japan was going to be the liberator of the colored peoples around the world. And this included Paul Robeson and many other thought leaders who were defending Japan at the time. I think there's a much more complicated history with China and various American demographics than we had with the old Soviet system and the Russians that will influence our ability to quote unquote hit back at China for what it says and does. And that's why I think we need a strategy more so in this particular case. And because it is truly an ideological struggle, the way that the Cold War wasn't. I mean, we can look back and it was a struggle, but it was still somewhat of a struggle within the Western family.
Okay, thank you. Adrian?
Yeah, I have a question to the panel, and it seems to me that the discourse on civilizational state in China presupposes that there is this synonymous overlap of the state and the civilization, and that is a discourse that we find elsewhere. But when we compare it to the West, surely it's very different, because no country in the West can legitimately claim to represent or embody the entire Western civilization. So even if America has preeminent status for all sorts of geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geocultural reasons, it still is not the whole of the West. So when we talk about sort of US-Chinese bipolarity, is that really a civilizational struggle? Is that a struggle that is primarily ideological with economic and political dimensions? And if it was a civilization struggle, wouldn't it have to involve not just America, but also the rest of the West? And then what sort of struggle would that be if the West isn't something that is synonymous with any one state? In fact, if Western civilization isn't really synonymous with statehood, in a way that perhaps Chinese civilization is much more focused on the state, even if I appreciate Xudong's point about the complexity of the Chinese state, that is not a monolith in itself. But I just wonder about that difference. Are we really talking about a civilizational struggle when it comes to America and China, or is that not really a struggle that would have to involve the rest of the West? And if so, what would that struggle really look like? Because it seems to me that a lot of this is about global hegemony and preeminence in economic and military terms. I don't quite see how civilization shapes that. If it's a civilization struggle, I think we're talking about something different. So I just wonder what the panel thinks of that.
Okay, but before we get to that answer, let me collect a couple of other questions. So hold on to this. Is it civilizational or is it bilateral? Yeah, please.
Yeah, so my question is very related to Adrian. First of all, I wanted to say thank you for the amazing presentations. And so I just wanted to give this a few big ideas about we are in times of turbulent change. China is our rival. So, and also many times Karen has mentioned this idea of we need a strategy. And I don't want to think about the strategy for America. I'm thinking about what has to be the strategy for the West. Because first of all, my spirit is always multilateralism, cooperation, but I think that the panel is going to say, this is not going to work, either with China, either with Russia. So last week we've seen in the NATO summit, the European Union summit, how the European Union and the US are very strong now together. Even though the European Union is becoming more united, they're talking about spending more money on defense. I don't want to say that this is what we need, but so I think it's kind of related to Adrian's question. What is the strategy we need to have as the West, right? To manage this type of world scenario, because we don't want more conflict to happen, right? So, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, that's a similar question. The coherence of the West. Here's another question, please, briefly.
I'd like to hear the panel's comments about the Tang dynasty.
Okay, that's
Let me
brief.
let me add a little bit to that. A little bit.
We're running out of time.
I understand. As it turns out, this was just Gordon briefly touched on this. It is our time. 720 years cycle, 60 years times 12. Ming Dynasty, Tang Dynasty, Han Dynasty. The pattern, based on my experience of senior Chinese leaders today, is to try to replicate the Tang Dynasty. I wonder if people are thinking about that.
Okay, thank you. And Dory, could you help me with the questions online, please?
Yeah.
Is Ken Johnson asking a question?
Yes, there's a hand up, Kenneth Johnson.
Yes, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Real quick, is there any evidence of a racial nationalism in regard to Chinese communism? You might remember the last time we had a major conflict with an Asian power was with Imperial Japan, and they did have a racialist ideology. And so I'm curious if there's any evidence of that alongside the regular communist doctrine in communist China.
Okay, and lastly, Dory, does George Schwab have a hand up? Or Anthony Tambori? No?
No.
Okay, all right. So those are the questions. Tang, race, and the coherence of the West in two different versions.
The Chinese people call themselves the Tang people, and some Chinese historians and some Chinese people say that Tang was the highest point in Chinese history. I think that there's certainly substantiation for that in many ways when you look at culture, for instance. But recently a lot of people will say no because of various reasons. But I like the idea. Han nationalism is very much driving Chinese policy. We see this in Tibet. We see this, of course, in what China calls Xinjiang. We see it on China's central television, overtly racist narratives on, for instance, the Spring Gala, which basically portray Black people as subhumans and primates. Yes, that's racist. This thing about civilization versus bilateral struggle, as much as I like Huntington, I think that this is a bilateral struggle. And the reason is, remember, the US, after the Cold War, believed it was the end of history, believed that if we worked with China, if the Chinese regime strengthened itself, that it would come to see its interests the same way that we do, and that it would see that it would have a stake in the international system. Robert Zoellick's famous comments from 2005 when he was Deputy Secretary of State. But as we've noticed, that as China's become stronger, it's not become benign. It's become hostile, belligerent, and provocative. We saw that it did a number of things, including deliberately selling illicit fentanyl, deliberately spreading coronavirus beyond its borders. These are things that have taken on the world. So I don't see this as the United States trying to compete with China because we want primacy. I see that we're competing because we're trying to protect our society. You go back to the Clinton administration. Clinton always had this notion, like Kissinger and Nixon, about how we had to sort of live in a world where China was dominant. This went back to the notion that Kiron talked about living with the Soviet Union. This was the mentality that drove policy elites in New York and Washington. And so therefore we work to help to integrate China into the international system. This is not a jealous struggle for power. Right now, what I see, we're defending ourselves from malicious Chinese acts, spreading coronavirus, spreading fentanyl, stealing hundreds of billions of dollars of US intellectual property each year, advocating surreptitiously and openly the violent overthrow of the United States government. These are things that China's been doing recently. So this is from my perspective, this is a fight for survival. This is not one for hegemony.
Xudong?
Yes, very quickly. I want to address the question about civilizational state. I think it's a misnomer. That the misnaming comes in the form of using this cultural, ethnocentric sort of a dynastic model to name a structural conflict, which is within the global capitalist system. It's, I think, I mean, in terms of methodology, I think we should really look at what, even the orthodox Marxists are still referred to as the infrastructure, namely the economic sort of the forces of production, so to speak, production, productivity, technology, and by extension, the social organization of labor, then moving on to some form of relations of production, namely wealth distribution, ownership, and so on and so forth. China is competing at this level. And that, for me, is the civilizational implication. Now, we're no longer talking about some kind of a Western civilization versus Eastern civilization, or the Han ethnic sort of a centered notion of empire versus some kind of a Roman Empire or American Empire. No, these are relatively obsolete categories as far as I can see. Precisely because they are static, sort of a rigid metaphysical constructs. Whereas we are looking at this contemporary history, which is fundamentally determined by productivity, by the system. The system not only about production, but also about production of values and the vitality, creativity, the ability to innovate, to reinvent yourself. So to that extent, I agree that the West, or in America, probably in particular, still holds this, a huge advantage over China. But China is competing for right now only semi-successfully at the level of material production, but falling short in other domains. So to that extent, I would conclude that this sort of a post-Westernism or era is too hasty and a fantastical, a notion mainly produced for some kind of immediate ideological or propagandist purpose, and to very little effect, precisely because of that.
Thank you. Kiron, you have the last word.
I reluctantly have to agree with what Gordon said, that this is a bilateral competition, or however you want to put it. I'd like to think it was us, the West, against China, but it's really about US and China. And I think it's much, much harder than the competition with the Soviet Union for some of the reasons that I've already stated. Our own political and cultural history with China will make it difficult for us to make the case that my co-panelists are trying to make now. I think that plays to China's advantage. And I think it plays to China's advantage in the rest of the world as well. And if we aren't able to persuade a handful of key countries in the global South, and those that should be in our camp within the transatlantic relationship that we have, to really see the China competition the way that we do, I don't think there's a way to prevail.
Okay, thank you. Join me in thanking the panelists, please.